Inter-country adoption, as we think of it today, started in South Korea. By the end of the Korean War, 2 million infants and children had been separated from their families of origin. From then through today, some 180,000 have been adopted to the US, Sweden, the Netherlands, France, Australia, and a dozen others. This project is about telling that story through our eyes, through our memories and our origins in Korea, our experiences in our adoptive families, in our adoptive countries. There have now been more than 60 years of intercountry adoption out of South Korea, setting the precedent for millions of adoptions out of many other countries. Stories like these help us better understand this very singular human experience.
Je ne sais pas combien de temps j'ai vécu en Corée. Simplement, j'ai été adoptée à l'âge de 18 mois.
Så det jag vet från mina adoptionspapper, det är att när jag föddes så var jag yngst av 5 döttrar. Och mina föräldrar hade inte råd att ha kvar mig för att de var också tvungna att ha en son.
I was born in 1984 and I was adopted to Tasmania in Australia in 1988. So I was 3.5 when I arrived. Growing up, I didn't know much except that I was in an orphanage for about 6 months before my Australian parents came to Korea to pick me up. And before the orphanage, I was told that I stayed with my maternal grandmother for a little while, and that my birth father had died in a motorcycle accident. But even back then, my parents were a little bit skeptical about that story because they'd heard that other Australian adoptees had received similar stories.
In the Holt records, it says that I was left on the doorstep of a man's house in Wonju, South Korea, and his name is Kim Jong-kwon, and there was an address given, but the address had a missing piece to it, so it wasn't easily found.
The moment that I kind of knew something was going to happen was the time my grandmother took me to the train station with my brother. And, you know, there was a stranger there. She handed us off to him. And, you know, it's interesting because it was just my grandmother. It wasn't my father. It wasn't my mother. And we went off on the train with a stranger. And, you know, at the time, I said, okay, I'm being given away. You know, somehow my grandmother's, you know, giving me away to the stranger and I'm going somewhere. Of course I was scared. We were both crying. And, you know, one of the last things that my grandmother said was, hey, you know, when you grow up, come visit me. And that is very, very distinct. And it makes me emotional to talk about it.
Ik groeide op in Nederland met het gevoel dat ik echt een Nederlands meisje was. En zoals ik al eerder zei, je blond haar en blauwe ogen had. Ook al was dat niet zo als ik in de spiegel keek, ik voelde me wel zo. En ik wilde ook zo zijn voor mijn Nederlandse adoptiefamilie. Omdat zij mij ook zo behandelde. Zij wilden me ook echt laten zien dat ik hun dochter was. En ik wilde hen laten zien ook dat ik hun dochter was. Omdat dat een hele belangrijke rol heeft gespeeld, heb ik als kind ook nooit naar mijn adoptieouders laten merken dat ik maar iets van Korea wilde weten. Dat ik op zoek was naar informatie over Korea. Ik stopte dat liever weg.
My twin brother and I were adopted to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We grew up there our entire childhood. Our adoptive father was Norwegian American, and our adoptive mother was German American. And of course, this was in the 1960s and early 1970s in Milwaukee. So it was a long time ago. There was virtually no consciousness around race. The way I like to describe it is that basically I grew up feeling like a Martian who had arrived from outer space in a spaceship. And years later, when I met other adoptees, it was like happening upon a convention of Martians and spaceships.
Och jag kunde inte heller relatera riktigt till min fysiska kropp. Jag kunde, alltså från att jag var ganska liten som barn, så kunde jag stå i spegeln och kolla mig så här djupt in i ögonen. Och bara fråga, hallå, vem är jag? Är det någon där inne? Tills det blev så djupt så att jag möttes av en skräck, en slags dödsrädsla. Det var nästan som när man kollar på skräckfilm. Att det var så här alldeles för läskigt. Men jag gjorde det ändå ganska många gånger.
Omdat het voor mijn gevoel altijd negatief was. Omdat mensen die mij confronteerden met mijn andere uiterlijk altijd het vanuit een negatief perspectief deden. Dus bijvoorbeeld een scheldwoord gebruikten van je bent een poep-Chinees. Of waarom heb jij van die spleetogen? Of waarom heb je zo'n platte neus? En altijd waar het kenmerken waarvan ik zoiets had van dat is voor mijn gevoel heel lelijk en heel negatief. En ik wil dat niet zijn.
I feel that that's the main thing from my childhood, just being very self-conscious and, hating mirrors and hating the way I looked. I have this memory of staring in front of the mirror at home in the bathroom. I would have only been about 4 or 5, and I was trying to pinpoint, trying to kind of intellectually figure out exactly what features made me look different. I didn't realize it's kind of just a combination of all my features. And I was also experimenting with putting talcum powder on my face, which is like pure white, because I thought that maybe it was my skin color that made me different. And I think back and feel sad about that little girl that was doing that and struggling with her appearance in such a way.
When I was growing up, around age 10 or so, Holt started the Holt Heritage Camp. And I think that's probably the best thing my parents could have done for me. And then that was the first time I think we've really had a serious, maybe, awareness of, hey, where did I come from? And, giving me an opportunity, a resource, an outlet to go and experience something that you're not going to ever experience. And that's being with other adoptees that were Korean.
I definitely think that by sophomore year in college, I had gone from an entirely white community of friends to an entirely Black and Asian community of friends. I really had a very strong connection with the Black students on my campus. I went to a very small school, and what I loved about the Black students was they had a vocabulary to describe what they were feeling in relation to being a person of color. And I had never identified myself that way. So I felt like I was learning a whole new language. their languages of racial justice, social justice, their ideas on just claiming themselves as a community of people was really intriguing to me.
Like most transracial adoptees who grew up back then, I grew up with almost zero racial consciousness, and no one gave me any. So I had to figure it out for myself. So I began to figure things out. So I came down to Chicago, and when I was 21, and it was a wonderful decision. It was really one of the best decisions I've made in my life. So for the first time, I was in a very large city. It was very diverse, and I was really beginning to make my way as a fledgling person of color in the world. I began to identify myself as Asian American. I made my very first tentative connections with a tiny bit of Korean culture or Korean American culture. This was really still before most people had the internet, so still the olden days. And so there was a lot that came to me later on. But the most important thing was, as a young adult, I began to realize that I could create my own identity. For me, the journey of being a transracial adoptee and the journey of being a gay person are actually very similar, psychologically and spiritually, at least in my own personal experience. In both cases, they involve really having to construct an identity on one's own, hopefully with help and support from others. It's taken me many years to become fully self-racialized, meaning to come to my own consciousness about what it means to be a person of color.
Part of the reason I searched, it wasn't necessarily to have a relationship with a Korean family or a Korean person. It was just my desire to have a picture of my birth mother, to know what she looked like, because I think as adoptees, we all want to know who we look like, where did our nose come from, or our cheekbones, or our hair. And these are questions that non-adoptees never have to think of, but it's something as adoptees we always wonder about. We always wonder what our biological parents look like.
En via Arirang heb ik ook mijn man leren kennen. Die is ook geadopteerd uit Korea. En die had sinds 1989 al contact met zijn Koreaanse familie. Dat vond ik heel interessant, want ik had echt zoiets van wauw. De mogelijkheid dat dat kan is heel klein. En bij hem is dat gelukt. En dan ook nog eens dat zijn Koreaanse familie echt ook een familie uit duizenden is. Die heel warm is en heel erg geïnteresseerd is in het leven van mijn man. En hoe die het doet in Nederland. En ja, je merkt van alle kanten, en dat merkte ik toen ook al, dat ze heel veel van hem houden.
The other thing that I've learned through my research is my mother, who would have been a gijichon, which is essentially a military prostitute. There were thousands of them in Korea. This is post-war Korea. And, it was essentially if women didn't work on the base, they worked on their backs. And my mom did the latter kind of work. So she... and my understanding is within that military camp town culture, you had women who, served either white soldiers or black soldiers. Clearly, my GI dad was white. I learned that, or I was told that he had rotated back to the U.S. before I was born, probably had no interest in me. I mean, that was the case with thousands of us mixed-race children who were born in Korea, and there were indeed thousands of us. In fact, we are the reason international adoption from Korea started. It was basically to purge the country of its human refuse, us, the mixed-race kids that were born to the Gichichon and the GIs that were there at the time.
Toen ik aankwam op het vliegveld, toen zag ik daar een beetje tegenop. Omdat mijn man natuurlijk meeging. En ik wist dat zijn familie op het vliegveld zou staan te wachten op hem. En ik had zelf voor mezelf zoiets natuurlijk van... ja, goed, als ik terugkom in mijn land, staat er niemand op mij te wachten. Er is niemand die denkt van... oh, daar komt Alice weer terug in Korea. Dus ik had voor mezelf echt een beetje een terughoudend gevoel van... oké, ik kom daar en ik wacht af tot de begroeting tussen mijn man en zijn familie geweest is. En dan kom ik misschien een beetje tevoorschijn. En het eerste wat gebeurde toen wij de gates doorkwamen en de douane door waren... en we de familie van mijn man zagen... was dat mijn schoonmoeder, de moeder van mijn man... met bloemen stond. En toen kwam ze op ons afgelopen. Dus ik was al een beetje van... oké, ze gaat mijn man begroeten. En toen liep ze niet op mijn man af, maar op mij. En toen gaf ze dus de bloemen aan mij... En toen zei ze dus van, welkom in Korea, in jouw land. En dat vond ik echt heel bijzonder. En daar was ik ook echt heel blij om.
Eller det bara blev att jag såklart åkte till Seoul sen och besökte mitt barnhem på Social Welfare Society i Seoul. Och då hade jag med mig en vän och så vi var där. Besöket varade kanske bara 30 minuter. Men jag har fortfarande blackout från det besöket. Det blev liksom en sån chock att bli så... konfronterad med sig själv och sitt förflutna i verkligheten. Att se då de här små barnen, bebisarna som ligger i sina små sängar. Alltså, det var ju som att se mig själv eftersom jag bara var 3 månader. Eller eftersom jag var från 0 till 3 månader när jag bodde där själv.
It was really my uncle that told me, and it was kind of painful to hear this next bit, but I'm actually very grateful he told me, because I don't think anyone else in my family would have. But he said that it was my great uncle that actually drove me to the agency to relinquish me, and that my great uncle still remembers that day. And I said to him, you know, Imo Harabuji, don't leave me here. I'll be a good girl. And that was it's quite a shock to hear that I was kind of conscious of, on some level at least, of what was happening. Because I think I'd assumed, because I didn't have any memories of that period, that I don't know what I'd assumed, but it was, you know, really surprising for me to hear that and think about how scary that would have been for a 3-year-old girl. So I remember my grandmother walked out of the room when my uncle told me that, and I've found it really hard to forgive her, you know, for a year or two after I heard that.
When you're abandoned in a public place and there's no record, there's no identifying information, my birth mother or father, nobody left a note, or, you know, some mothers would pin their child's birth date to their coat or something and try to just leave a little crumb. So I had no crumbs. So when you have no crumbs, I think I've always had very low expectations in thinking that I could find any biological family.
En fait, depuis une radio que j'ai passée du bassin pour voir si ma fille pourrait passer
parce que je faisais du diabète gestationnel. Donc le risque, c'était que le bébé soit trop gros et ne puisse pas passer. Donc je devais passer une radio. Et le radiologue est resté assez longtemps à observer ma radio et m'a appelé dans son bureau pour me demander si j'avais eu un accident récemment ou parce qu'il était surpris de voir que j'avais des séquelles de multiples fractures. Bon. Et puis j'étais enceinte, j'étais heureuse, j'avais eu du mal à avoir ce premier enfant, donc pour moi j'étais vraiment, c'est dans mon tempérament, je suis quelqu'un de positif, je suis quelqu'un qui va de l'avant, je suis quelqu'un de joyeux, voilà. Donc j'ai attendu un petit peu et puis quand même le week-end suivant, je suis allée chez mes parents et j'ai demandé à ma maman, puisque c'est elle qui avait échangé le plus à l'orphelinat à l'époque, d'où pouvaient provenir ces multiples fractures. Donc je savais juste dans le dossier que j'étais un enfant rachitique, voilà, que je souffrais comme beaucoup de malnutrition. L'histoire que j'avais entendue, c'était que j'étais probablement issue d'un couple mixte, donc une maman coréenne et un soldat américain. Mais c'est tout, et j'avais jamais posé de questions. Bon, puis là, en fait, lorsque je lui ai posé la question, je l'ai sentie mal, elle s'est mise à pleurer et elle m'a dit j'aurais préféré ne jamais avoir à te le dire, mais puisque tu me poses la question, voilà ce qu'on m'a dit. C'est que tu es une enfant née d'un adultère. Ce qui signifie que tu as grandi auprès de ta maman, de son mari. Et lorsque le mari aurait découvert que ce n'était pas son enfant, mais l'enfant d'un soldat américain, au lieu d'aller déposer gentiment le bébé à l'orphelinat, comme je pense les autres ont été déposés, l'histoire veut que moi, il m'a jeté de la voiture devant l'orphelinat. Ça paraît tellement violent hein, et inconcevable pour moi qui était toute jeune maman, que j'ai voulu le mettre de côté dans un petit tiroir. Et puis les années passant, je gardais toujours... j'avais des flashs de cet acte sans nom. Donc... j'étais choquée, mais en même temps, je voulais l'oublier. Et puis finalement, j'ai pas pu l'oublier.
We're walking there, and my heart is pounding, and I'm thinking, this is it. This is the thing I've always wanted. I've always wanted to find the place where I was found. Here we are, and the camera's rolling, and we're walking there. And, you know, in the single most unexpected emotional experience of my life, I had the rug pulled out from underneath me, because in my mind, when I find that place where I was left as a newborn on January 5th, 1974, it's gonna be like this triumphant moment, this revelatory moment. I'm gonna feel so satisfied, so happy. I finally found the place that I was left at. This is what I've always wanted. I mean, my bar was so low. Most people want to meet their biological family. I just want to stand at that spot and have a moment to myself that this is where it all started, and that will be good enough for me. And I thought I would feel so triumphant and like I reached my goal. And I got there and I just broke into tears. I was a mess. And it was devastating. It wasn't it was not a celebratory moment. It was not a triumphant moment. Any satisfaction about having found the place was completely usurped by this, tidal wave of grief and pain and one of the most profoundly lonely moments I've ever had in my entire life. And I, in my mind's eye, as we're standing in front of this man's house, what I saw was a little baby, 3 days old, in the cold weather, on a winter's day, sitting on the doorstep by herself. And for me, it was so hard and so lonely and sad. And even though I have so much to show for myself now and many things in my life that I feel very proud of and grateful for, none of that mattered in that moment. None of it. It didn't matter that I grew up to be a healthy person with a loving family, and a good education, and a good job. None of that mattered. All that mattered in that moment was that this is how my life started, alone, on the doorstep at 3 days old.
And I'm sitting there, and the two women are sitting there looking at me, and the one woman says, "Does she have any scars on her body?" And I said, "Well, I have one on my leg." And they said, "That's the only one that I remembered pre-coming to America." And I said, "I remember getting burned by an iron." And she started crying once that got translated. And she said, "It was all my fault. I had just ironed my husband's shirt, and I told you not to go near the iron, but you did anyway. And you burned yourself, but then you knew you were gonna get in trouble, so you didn't say anything. You didn't cry, you just sat there." And I had stockings on, so she immediately came over and wanted to lift up my skirt and look for the scar. And I was like, why would I make this up? How would I know this story? And so I'm thinking this woman is my birth mother. It turns out it was my aunt. The woman sitting next to her was my birth mother. And she came over and she sat next to me, and she just kind of did the full body scan from head to toe. And she took my hand and she gave me a ring she was wearing. And she said, "We have the same hands." And then I finally looked at her and I said, "We do. We have the same ears. We have the same size feet." I didn't have a lot of emotions. I think I was just stunned that there was a real human being sitting next to me who was my birth mother. And we went to a restaurant and we sat across from each other. And I don't think I ever looked at her, and just started talking. I asked a lot of questions about being raised in America and my adoptive family. And then we agreed to meet again a couple of days later, and I spent a weekend with her. Getting to know her has been really hard. The weekend that I spent with her, she barely looked at me, and I barely looked at her. And at one point, she was in the room, and she said, "I know you're my daughter, but the last time I saw you, you were 3, and now you're this grown woman, and I don't know who you are." I was so desperate for her to know that I was happy, and that I was okay. And that's all I could say. "I'm happy, I'm okay, don't worry about me."
We ended up meeting at a restaurant with a translator and with my grandmother there. And I told her, I remember what she said, and that was the grandmother that led me to the train. And, told her, "I'm back. I'm here." And, everything is fine. Everything worked out. And from talking to, I guess, the siblings, my half brother and sister on my father's side. I have one brother and one half sister. That he never forgot about us. He actually tried to come back and get us a month later. He changed his mind. And to live with that guilt your whole entire life would have to have been very difficult. And my siblings would say, every time he gets drunk, he would say your names. And he would yell out for you guys. And that's how we knew that you guys existed. I have a couple kids, and I could just imagine how difficult that would have been. But, at the end of the day, I appreciate what he did.
I think I was in denial for 50 years. It's a painful thing to have to look at. And, the first thing, that any of us looks at as an adoptee is the fact that we lost something. And I think those early life losses always stay with you. I think that's always been inside of me. And as an adult, I can look back on it and say that I think the way I internalized that experience was I was bad, I was defective, there was something wrong with me. So I sort of grew up with that self-concept.
Men nu, så att hela mitt liv är bara totalt öppet. Och jag hoppas att det här är bara början på en mycket starkare kontakt och mod att våga följa mitt hjärta. Och att lägga den här hela adoptionsresan bakom mig. Men ändå bevara det som jag fått uppleva i hjärtat. Och omfamna den här sorgen som jag känner ändå.
The South Koreans view us, I think, this is my interpretation, as being a part of the tribe, but kind of in some distant outer ring of the tribe, and not a very well accepted ring either. I very strongly urge any Korean adoptee who is interested to go visit, but I also immediately advise them that if they think that it's going to be an easily integrated experience, they should think again. Or as one adoptee said at a conference session, I thought that by going to South Korea, I would be able to put all my puzzle pieces together, but I just ended up with more puzzle pieces.
But I still love Korea. I miss it a lot. I miss my birth family a lot. And I think for me it feels like a kind of sadness that I've learnt to live with, I guess, because, when I miss it and I know that I can't get back for a certain time, I think it's just one of a few sadnesses that I've learnt to live with and carry with me, if that makes sense.
Je connais le Japon, je connais la Thaïlande. Mes enfants avaient adoré la Thaïlande. Et je ne connais pas ce pays d'Asie, ce pays pays du matin calme, dans lequel je suis née. Donc voilà, c'est tout ce qui manque à mon histoire. Et donc maintenant, à chaque fois qu'il y a un concours organisé où il y a des billets d'avion à gagner, je joue. Et je suis déçue parce que je perds à chaque fois, mais j'espère très prochainement avoir assez d'argent pour me payer ce voyage du bout du monde. Et c'est un rêve très, 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 très cher.